This is why sometimes you don't just let the program staff deal with the technical stuff, because we don't always do it well. All right, so as I said before, and I'll just repeat for this recording, that Reverend Sharon was not able to be with us today, and so she recorded her lecture. And so now I'm going to share it with you all, and let us hope that this works well.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Sharon Dittmar, and I'm a congregational life consultant with the Mid-America region of the UUA. And I have the pleasure and privilege of teaching our session on family system theory and also conflict with Lisa Presley. So this is number 3 in our series, and the session on conflict is number 4, and they dovetail nicely. They're actually going to use the same case study that you were introduced to in the preparatory reading. I'm sorry I can't be with you here today, but I have a recorded presentation for you that's really just going to be a quick review of the material you have already considered. And then the majority of your time together is going to be an opportunity for you to write in response to some questions and to meet in breakout rooms and discuss with other members in this class their thoughts and experiences. I hope you enjoy that. That's often how you can practice this material the best, is not just learning it, but actually living into it. So the session I'm going to present you this morning is on Bowen family system theory, and Murray Bowen created his system actually in the 1940s. And it's very interesting because he observed not only what was in the natural world in terms of what was a observable pattern, but also what went on in a whole system, not just one person, but how did one person's behavior impact other people, and then how did other people impact a whole of a group. So he was really a unique thinker, and many of his lessons resonate in our congregations today. So I am going to move to share my screen. Here we go. So I want to begin with these quotes. Working with anxious congregations, I always remind them that they have invited me to help them not to waste their suffering. The leader will need to challenge the congregation, anxious souls as they may be, to use anxious times as a springboard for change, learning, and different functioning. And this is by the consultant Peter Steinke, who just died in 2020, who wrote many wonderful books, including this one, Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, Remaining Calm and Courageous No Matter What. It's a book I routinely consulted when I worked in congregations, and I still do today. And also, there was an optional viewing of a 40-minute case study done by Steinke, and it's a role-played case study. But if any of you are in the middle of conflict, you might find that 40-minute viewing valuable to you, because it really plays on how one change, in this case, the addition of a worship service, can cause people to act, and how they act then impacts the system, and then how the leaders need to respond and the choices the leaders make and their responses. So, and here's another quote from the educator Paulo Freire, who wrote in the last millennium. This is Gendered Language. He was a wonderful educator. He wrote, "While no one liberates himself by his own efforts alone, neither is he liberated by others." And I really liked this quote because I think it referred to the concept of differentiation, which we read so much about in our preparatory readings that appeared in almost every article and the one video. So here we go. More about Bowen family systems theory. As I told you, it's a system of human behavior created by the psychiatrist Murray Bowen. It views the family as a unit, and it is concerned about the emotionality within the unit. And it says that a family is a unit, a neighborhood, a work group, and a congregation, even a country, are all emotional units. There's some major concepts in family systems theory, and we're going to look at just a few of them today, the ones that impact our congregations the most. triangles, excuse me, differentiation, which we read a lot about, as well as emotional process, including fusion and cutoff. If any of these things here look like they're of interest to you or overlap in an area of study, there's a link where you can learn more. I'm actually currently taking a class online with the Bowen Center for Family Studies, and it's wonderful in case any of you get more interested in this work. And also, the reason I selected this photo, in case you were wondering, is that it's a white whooping crane in the midst of sandhill cranes. And so it's like how to be together, but separate is really the task of differentiation. You need to be in relationship, but you need to be yourself, and you might just be a little bit different than others. All right, we're going to look first at the concept of triangulation. Now, I want you to first go to the note at the bottom, which says that in some cultures, there are often third parties involved, such as elders, parents, or a respective figure, and traditional ideas of greater family closeness. And these cultures and families can be both healthy and differentiated. And a book you can really look at to learn more about this is Socially Attuned Family Therapy, Guidelines for Equitable Theory and Practice. There's a chapter in here on Bowen theory, which is just excellent. It really highlights areas of power differential and identity and social norms and how they impact different groups differently. So I'm going to use that lens as I unpack Bowen's theory around triangulation. So Bowen has this idea that if party A is upset or party B is upset by something that party A did, they might bring in a rescuer, someone that takes the tension between party A and party B. Now, if we look at the socially, culturally tuned, we can realize this might be important. You might want to involve an elder. There might be a way that this is normative in your culture, society to do this. The problem happens when, and if you look at that Steinke video, you'll see this, when a person has a concern and instead of going directly to someone to talk about it, to be in relationship, they avoid relationship, go around party A and bring in a third party, a fourth party, a fifth party, and start to complain. And pretty soon, for example, the board might receive a letter of complaint from a variety of concerned members. So there's this attempt to get people to communicate directly in a timely fashion and to speak in a respectful manner. Again, though, not everyone's comfortable speaking directly. That's not always a cultural norm. People have different power in different situations, right? For some people, it's safer to speak directly than others. And so I invite you to hold this curiously and to be aware of your identities and norms and those of other people in the groups you work in and how that might shift. Are people able to speak directly or not? And what adaptations might or might not need to be made because of that. Here's this other thing, emotional fusion and emotional cutoff. Let's look at fusion first, and I'll explain the photo in a moment. Fusion happens when people lose their self, okay? They lose their differentiated self. It occurs when both are nice to one another to tighten their bonds. That is, both people are nice to tighten their bonds, and each one functions to take care of the other person's feelings. Congregations, according to Steinke, are uniquely vulnerable to fusion. People resist information that might disturb their peace and or their truth or what they want to believe about themselves. If people are emotionally linked, they might not have sufficient space to challenge one another. This is where congregations run into trouble setting boundaries for people with difficult or disruptive behaviors, or they let the largest donor get away with something that they might not let someone else get away with, or they suppress concerns about equity, right? All of these things can happen because of emotional fusion in the system. And in fact, discrimination occurs because we are too fused. Here's another one, emotional cutoff. Cutoff is reactive. It's an automatic defense. A well-defined stance is chosen, thought through, and clearly expressed. When cutoff happens, a person attempts to gain a sense of identity over and against the other person. So I will not speak to you. I am writing you out of the will. I'm disinviting you to the meeting. I'm telling secrets about you. By projecting a negative label on another, the person seeks to gain a positive identity for themselves. The emotional distancer often becomes dogmatic, opinionated, doctrinaire, We've seen this in politics in our country in the last year. So these are two signs of anxiety, both when we all have to agree or we refuse to speak with one another or listen to our differences, right? The reason I chose this photo is, and it's actually a photo of me at a former Midwest leadership school, maybe 3 years ago when it was at Luther College in Iowa. And Tony Sweezy is behind me with the rabbit ears. And, you know, so I was the teacher, but in a relationship, you can be different and close, and it's okay to like have fun and knowingly joke around with one another. That's the sign of a healthy system, right? We have enough trust. Okay. Here are some behaviors in anxious systems. We look for scapegoats, right? Someone else is the problem. We discriminate, like I mentioned. We use blame and shame. We look for someone to blame. The feeling of anxiety is contagious. We dislike differences. We don't want to hear that different people want different things in worship or music or the religious education program. We break relationships and or disregard their maintenance. We support inequity through emotional fusion. Isn't that interesting? I actually want to read you a quote from Socially Attuned Family Therapy, that chapter I told you about. Inequities inspire anxieties. A well-differentiated system would recognize and address fairness issues openly and directly. And so then the inverse would be a system not differentiated, would not want to recognize it, not want to think about it. They would say everyone's the same here, or we're all treated equally, right? And that we know that's not true, right? There's prejudice everywhere. Discrimination exists. We disregard the impact of family history and current social context. That's another issue. We realize that we disregard that there are differences that make a difference, right? And sometimes behavior anxious systems like to focus on someone as an identified patient. And that's kind of an interesting role that someone can play or some issue can play. Often there's an issue under the identified patient. So there's someone we're concerned about, but the underlying issue. And sometimes it means not holding it as, I wish that person would go away, but holding it as, what role does that person fill? Why does our group allow that role to be filled? For example, the disruptive person, okay? Something else about blame and shame, I actually see that a lot. And it comes out in your congregational meeting if someone's like, well, the Canvas chair didn't do a good job, that's why we didn't raise enough money. That's like blame and shame. Possibly the Canvas chair fell short, but some better questions to ask would be, did the Canvas chair have the resources they need? Did the board or finance committee start the Canvas early enough? Did the congregation move forward into the role of being canvassers, right? So that systems are complicated. And that's like another thing I really want to lift up. Anxious people want to find one answer, one and done, and they don't want it to be about them. They don't have a contribution or role, right? I often think when something goes wrong, the more mature members in a group can say, what was my role? And what are some of the larger forces at play in the system that enabled this to take place? All right, this is another photo from Midwest Leadership School, the youth participants from several years ago. Here's the impact of anxiety on anxious systems, all right? And anxiety is always with us. And again, it's not a bad thing. It's just knowing it's present and knowing what its presence means, and then making decisions about how you want to work with it. And conflict's similar. Conflict can be very positive. I want to say that again. Conflict can be very positive. It's just more being aware of it and then making choices around it. So if we are aware that anxiety is in a system, here are some of the things we will see according to Bowen as patterns that manifest. We will see a decrease in our capacity to learn. We will replace curiosity with a demand for certainty. I actually see that a lot in congregational life, right? We're tired, we're scared, we want an answer. We want it to be an easy answer too. We don't want to have to learn how to do things sometimes, like dismantle white supremacy culture, right? It stiffens our positions over and against one another, interrupts concentration, floods the nervous system so that we can't hear what's said. When someone starts yelling at a meeting, most of us sort of seize up. That can be a good moment to say, let's take a breath, let's all be silent for a minute. Why don't we write what's on our minds? Let's see if we can come back and talk a little bit after a break. Simplifies ways of thinking. I know you've looked at the Tema Okun material, so that would be there has to be right or wrong, yes or no, either or. Things can be complicated. And a great question to ask is what else, right? You're not done. What else? What else led to this problem? What else? Prompts a desire for a quick fix. You know, sometimes we tell people in situations of conflicts, it'll be a few years, and they'll be like, they'll want to blame someone for coming in and not fixing it in a weekend. Most things take time, right? Rouses feelings of helplessness that are painful. We don't know what to do. And I think that's where Tema Okun's work comes in so useful, right? If we don't have to be perfect, it's okay to feel helpless sometimes. We're learning, we're in process, we're not perfected. Leads to defensive behaviors, diminishes flexibility, creates imaginative gridlock. So anxious systems often lose the flexibility to be creative just when they need it the most. Okay, so some things you can do if you're a leader is sometimes slowing down a meeting, going back and reviewing your bylaws or policies can be helpful if you're in the middle of conflict. Trying to look for a larger lens, what else is involved here, who else might be a stakeholder not at the table we can consult with. All those sorts of ways of thinking are important. And actually, I should go back to this. When we're anxious and when we're doing things like scapegoating, we're often pulling away from people. Remember that emotional fusion or cutoff that I talked about, the emotional cutoff, okay? One of the techniques in the midst of conflict or anxiety is to attempt to draw closer to people who are upset or people who you do not agree with. Now, as I say that, I want to be clear that not everyone has the energy. Some people are more at risk. Some people have identities that have been more harmed. And I don't think you need to be harming yourself if you engage in this way. But if you are a person who has privileges in the system, who has power in the system, something that you can be thinking about is, even though I don't agree with these people, how can I move closer to be in relationship with them, okay? So if you're differentiated, you are, quote, a non-anxious presence. You focus on your own behavior as the one thing that you can change rather than being preoccupied with how other people function. The person that always complains at the meeting is going to complain. You're not going to stop them, right? You're not even going to try and stop them. You can frame the meeting so that they don't have as much time by saying, we're going to let everyone speak once before anyone gets to speak again, and everyone's limited to 2 minutes. You can try things like that. Your job is not to get them, though, to be different. The job is to make sure that you are acting in a way that feels differentiated, caring, non-reactive, creative, thoughtful, relational, okay? So self-differentiated is that capacity to take I statements in the midst of a group. So to be both in relationship and to be unique, and to have those I statements based on some sort of enduring values that are not just transient, right? You can create a positive emotional field if you can differentiate in this way that influences the congregation to withstand anxiety. And to do this, I think, needs some mindfulness around personal and family history, its impact, as well as social context, trauma, power differentials, and identities. So sometimes how I present myself in one group where I am the majority is actually different than how I'll present myself in a group where I am the minority. And I think that's an important mindfulness. Those of us who come from dominant cultures don't sometimes understand what it's like to have to adapt our behavior. And I think that's a great growth spot for many of us that I like to be curious about. And I hope that you will be too, because there's some ouches and oopses in that work too, right? I have learned to change based on the mistakes I've made. So one of the things I like to be differentiated about enough is to just be like, yeah, I make mistakes and I learn from them all the time. And I hope to do better in the future. I like this photo because I think a culture that embraces, that wants to decrease anxieties and is differentiated, recognizes and addresses fairness and equity, right? So it's going to be like, how can everyone have a good experience using public bathrooms? I think that's a great societal question. Gender neutral restrooms. Here we have it, okay? And it just feels good to me to be in a group that would be mindful about the differences that make a difference and want to consider how to move in that direction. So when a group has a lack of differentiation, it accommodates to relieve the pain of others. Oh, you're unhappy, you're a long-term donor. Let me take away the source of your unhappiness, even if it's dismantling white supremacy culture. Focuses on the others. Are you happy yet? Are you happy yet? Connects emotionally. Oh my goodness, I'm so unhappy, you're unhappy. Sets vague goals. Your goal might be my happiness. No, wait, the next person's goal is my happiness. Doesn't want to upset others. The truth is, in a congregation, you can't please everyone. That's not your job. Your job is to live the mission of the congregation. Okay, that's a better grounding point that is more stable, right? Because different people want different things, and our job is not to make everyone happy. All right, our job is to live our values. So in differentiation, we take a stand based on values. We focus on self. I'm self-aware. I actually know when I'm triggered. There's that great article in the pre-reading on managing your own anxiety. I think really good leaders are honest about, gosh, this makes me really anxious. I'm a little scared. They shall share that with a group that will support them. They get support for it. They find a therapist. I certainly know as a minister, I often felt triggered. I was in long-term therapy to help me so that I could try to be as non-reactive and differentiated as possible. We stay connected to others when we can, and we are not harmed by doing so. We set clear goals and mission, and we actually seek challenges, right? We seek challenges. All right, last slide here. Here's some positives. So you can find transformation if you can manage your anxiety and your conflict. And when they come, that's just why they're opportunities, not so much to be feared, but to be embraced. Here's an opportunity to find out who we are and what we might need to learn, okay? So one thing to do is reframe the problem. It's not just that Joe failed as the director of religious education. There's often an opportunity for us to grow, to learn, to try something new, to listen to others, to think larger, to set boundaries, develop policies, consider inequities, right? All of these things are related. Good structure corrals anxiety. I think it's important to communicate early and often, consistently, and share what process you're using, even if you are creating the process while flying a plane. I recently worked with a board where all the officers resigned. I mean, they had to sit in there with their bylaws and be like, okay, what do we do now? And they just had to be transparent. That's what they were doing. The great is the enemy of good. This is not about perfection. We can get rid of that idea. Healing process of a mid-range to severely anxious congregation is 2 to 5 years and 8 years for the highest level. I think sometimes it's just important to normalize it. And again, there's a lot of opportunity for learning in here. There will be hurts and harms, but there can be long-term change, which will be useful for the mission and ministry of your congregation. If conflict and anxiety are high enough, there will be losses in membership. So you're not just trying to prevent people from leaving. Some people are like, I'm afraid someone will stop pledging. Yeah, they might. Or leave. Yeah, they might. And that might be what needs to happen, right? Everything always changes. And the one thing you can control is yourself, right? If someone yells at you, you don't always have to yell back. So I think focusing on yourself and differentiation is essential. So I'm going to stop screen sharing right here. Thanks so much for your time today. And now we have a series of questions for you to write on and then meet together in groups. And I really look forward to being with you at our next session as we continue our work with the case study.
So I really appreciate Sharon's conversation in this, and one of the things we're learning is that rather than lecture with you for a long time, it's best for you to be able to dive into the material. So that's why I sent out the case study earlier this week so that you would have it. I also right now am posting a link to it. This is a link in Google Drive. I didn't want you to have to go sign into the UU Institute platform if you didn't have it. Because what we're going to do now is you're going to take 15 minutes to answer the questions that are on the back, on the second page of that case study. So what you're going to do, I'm just copying those questions to also put those in the chat so you can have them here before you go. What we're going to do is you're going to have 15 minutes to yourself to be able to reflect on the questions, reread the case study, and come up with your answers to the questions about where you see anxiety, triangulation, emotional fusion, things like that. How would you feel if you were on the board, and what would trigger you? What roles do you see people, groups playing? What character do you relate with to, and why? What character do you find the most difficult, and why? What are the primary emotions that get expressed in this congregation? What emotional system or systems could benefit from improvement in this congregation? And if you were a member, what would you try to do to make beneficial change? What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to put you in your groups now, and then I will broadcast to the groups in 15 minutes that it's time for you to have a discussion. You're going to have 30 minutes for discussion. So if you need to, make sure during your 15 minutes you take a mini bio break if you need that. And then, go to your group, but then feel free to turn off your camera and to work for the 15 minutes. And I will send one of those messages that says 15 minutes is up. I will try to pop into some of your groups. There's a lot of groups and there's only one of me, so I'm not sure if I can get there. But if you need help, once you are in the breakout room, under the More button, there will be a thing that says Ask for Help. And if you click that, it gets, you then are able to chat with me, and I can come into your group if need be. So any questions before we get into that? 15 minutes for work on your own, 30 minutes conversation around these questions in the case study. The link to the case study is in the, homeostasis is the property that keeps things working the way they are. That things are balanced, so that the pressures are in such a way that it's so sometimes that can be in a positive way or a negative way for the congregation, but it's just basically the way things are. The identified patient is the person we want to blame rather than what might actually be going on. So, oh, so-and-so is acting out. Well, why are they acting out? Does it really have anything to do? They're another scapegoat might be another name for that. So I'm going to now magically create those breakout rooms and send you away.
I pressed the button. Eeks.
That's okay.
I didn't mean to press the button.
Oh, sorry. And everyone is flooding back in. Some people stay until they're pulled out, and others come back when they see the sign. I'm sure there is something in there for some PhD dissertation about Zoom behavior. Do you come back as soon as as it says you have a minute, or do you wait till the minute? And some groups are wait until the last second, which is lovely, which is absolutely lovely. When everybody comes back before you close the rooms, then you know that it didn't work. All right, so what we're going to be doing now is we're going to have some conversation for about 20 minutes or so. And just in a larger group. Hazel, I see you have your hand up. Did you want?
I do. Lisa, when you stepped into our room, I wanted to ask you, none of the people in my group understood identified patients. And I wonder if perhaps you could give us a good explanation about what that is. Thank you.
So, so let me give an example. I'm glad you asked the question because the first thing we're going to do is what questions do you have? And one of the things I want to do is encourage you also to put them in the chat if you like. And that way, we can, the ones that stump me, we can pass along to Sharon and make her work more on this. But let me give an example. So let's say there's a family where there's a teenager who ends up drinking and takes a family car one night drunk and smashes it into a tree. Ordinarily, one might point to the young person as being the problem. But in a systems approach, you would look at what else is going on in the family. And it might be that the parents are arguing. It might be that there's a divorce going on. It might be that there's financial strain. But what happens is the troubles in the family get pinpointed on that teenager as the problem. So they're scapegoated as the problem, whereas it might actually be a reaction to what else is happening in the system. Does that help, Hazel? Okay. What other questions do you have? Are there any that I can, you can play Stump the Chump with me like that on the Car Talk show on NPR, where you always called in and tried to get Tom and Ray to solve your call problems. And you can, if you have a question or anything, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And the way to raise your hand is go to the reactions button on the bottom, and there's a place for you to raise the hand. I can't see you all on one screen at once, so that's why I need you to do that, or just frankly unmute yourself if you like. Was this example meant to imply that they were not having virtual services with Zoom? I don't know. Sharon wrote the case study. You can make whatever, in case studies, you make the assumptions that you want. Sam, can you, Glenn, I see your hand is up first, and then we'll have Sam.
I'm unclear on sabotage, on exactly how that comes out as a concept.
So sabotage is the power or the ability of a system to do things that prevent something from happening. So when you sabotage something, like you might bet against your own team, to sabotage them because you don't really think what's going on. In this sense, and this is a good one to ask Sharon, and so I'm going to write some of these down so I do it. Sabotage is when you might ask somebody to do something, but you don't provide them the resources, or you make sure that all the leaders know that even though you're asking so-and-so to carry out a task, you don't really intend them to do it. So it's an undermining of the situation, I believe. And I'll double check that with Sharon. Sam.
Yeah, it's related to Glenn's question of sabotage. If we were thinking that, or if it was the case study was presented to say the VP putting the resignation on the social media was a form of sabotage to kind of go against what was happening. Whereas, I can kind of see it as two things where it seems like the VP didn't really have any other choice. And that was how they decided, maybe not the best approach, but if that was meant to be sabotage, it kind of seems like, people trying to exert any control that they have where they feel unconsidered, just seems sabotage is kind of like, making it seem bad, or like they're not interested in the whole group, whereas everybody wasn't really considered in this case. So I just had some problems with thinking that, like, no, the whole group, there wasn't like a town hall or something presented with this.
But there could be sabotage depending on what the covenant is between the board. If they speak with one voice, if they don't bring these things up, so I'm not exactly sure. Again, Sharon wrote this, is more nuanced. I'm going to go to a couple in the chat. Somebody said, what are emotional systems? Meant by emotional systems, it's really, what are the emotions that are driving the process, that are there to be able to understand, sort of. So some congregations, some groups are anxious. That's their emotional system. The emotional system might be that they have conflicts. Some it might be that they love everyone and they provide space for differing opinions. It just describes really what's the emotional field or context in the situation. Let's see what else is here in the chat. The the founders writing a letter to the board without speaking to the minister. Yeah, I mean that happens. Part of that, it depends on depending on the system, the role of the minister may or may not be clear, and the role of the minister may be clear in a positive way or in a negative way. It might be seen that the minister doesn't really have any power or control in the situation. And so what I want to do then is call on Erin, Erin, unless I see your pictures off. I don't know if you, okay. We get to see somebody else in your family. Hooray. So please, your question or comment. You're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. We talked a lot about what's the balance between self-differentiation in that you're taking personal stand, you're keeping personal boundaries versus just kind of letting everybody in the congregation do whatever they want, right? Or in that you end up fracturing, right? You've got, virtual religious education and, you basically have two congregations, right? One that's meeting, one that's not. And so how do you, the whole idea is to come together as a group in covenant. So how that balance was very difficult for us to sort of understand, I think.
Right. Self-differentiation. So let me give an example. I was at a training program where it was being led by a woman who was Jewish. And we would begin every day with some kind of devotional, some opening or whatever. And I noticed that she never showed up for it. And I was getting sort of annoyed because it, to me, felt as if it was impolite. But then what I realized was that she was self-differentiated enough to know that this was not her worshiping community. This was not her group. She was following her own rituals and her own practices and doing that while still remaining connected with us. So that might not be the perfect example, but it could be that, so self-differentiation is knowing that you really have no ability to change anyone else's behavior. One of the things that Sharon said repeatedly in her recording was that the only thing you have control over is yourself. So you can't bring people together, but then you also can't, so knowing who you stand, where you stand, what your values are, not acting out against other people, but also not being subsumed or brought into other people's anxiety around that is part of that. Margaret, I see your hand up and I know you posted a great comment earlier, so I'm hoping you're going to help me out with this too.
Yeah, our group thought that the part-time DRE was showing being differentiated more than any of the other characters in there, that they clearly said why they were not going to be able to participate if the church came back, but was not holding everyone else hostage to their own health needs, and was willing to work with anybody about doing programming for children if that was the decision that the congregation made, and was not taking sides, was not joining in the debate about whether to or whether not. They were clear from the beginning that whatever the decision, they weren't going to be able to participate because of their own health issues, but were willing to continue doing their job to the best of their ability under those circumstances.
Right. And thank you, Margaret. I think that's a really good example in this, and that it's about being able to stand your own ground while still being in relationship without the need to, and I'm sorry, stand your ground is a horrible phrasing given what those laws are. So I'm sorry for that and hope it didn't, but knowing your place in the world, being able to say, this is what works for me and this is these are my boundaries. but not being cut off, staying in relationship, and knowing and not buying into the anxiety of others. So another question Sharon left for us was, what did you learn about yourself from these conversations? And feel free to put things in the chat or to raise your hand. And this could be around who you identified with, who you disliked the most in this situation. Glenn, please.
These were extreme examples, but I learned that I'm a little bit better than I thought I might be at leadership. You know, I've got really good surroundings and good backup, but we've done well in recent troubles, not just COVID, but other troubles. So, you know, I was kind of felt blessed by the whole thing.
Great, thanks, Glenn. And I love some of the comments, Erin. I love your comment that therapy for anxiety disorder has helped me a lot on this topic. Yes, I always say to ministers that they are that they should all have therapists, you know, because it's so easy to get caught up. And Margaret, your comment about you're too emotionally involved, there's nothing when you're self-differentiated, you can still be emotionally involved. It's whether or not the emotional involvement, how it impacts your behavior and how you let the anxiety live. And one things that I know is that a lot of boards will hold major anxiety for the congregation, like, oh my God, the finances are in trouble, and feel it's their job to do that, where I often will say, you need to share that anxiety with the congregation because it's not the board's problem, it's the congregation's problem. So how do you look at sharing appropriately the anxiety? Not going, you bad people, you're not giving money, but just saying, you know, we're in a real pickle here because we're not sure what to do. And so we want to let you know, and you do it not with blame or shame, because I don't know who has found blame or shame useful in their lives, but I know it's not me, but to figure out how to do all of that, to balance that. So to hold the tensions and to not, part of the self-differentiation too is to be able to not expect those easy answers and to hold the tension and to live in the complexity. One of the things I've long said is that UUs are great at asking questions, but we're horrible about not having answers. We often want a certainty in the situation. Andrea, and Glenn, I don't know if your hand is still up or if it's up a second time. I can take it, put it down for you. Okay, so Andrea, please.
Just one thing that struck me was that the date on this exercise was last fall. So that even if this congregation had gotten its act together and somehow everybody had come to an agreement about how they should proceed, it all changed. Whatever it was, it all changed. And it's still in the process of changing. So I think it helped remind me that it's not that you have a simple problem that you can solve. It's a continuum of things that will come up that need to be dealt with. And some of them may be, you know, finite, like, oh dear, the heater, the furnace broke, so you have to fix the furnace. But that is even itself part of a larger thing. Okay, how do we deal with maintaining our property and how do we get the money for that? So everything is continuous. And that's it's kind of frightening on one hand because the board does sit with that.
Right.
That's why
yes.
they put you on the board so that you would sit with it and they didn't have to.
Right, and you have the opportunity as a board to develop your culture about how are you going to respond to these things. One of the things that, one of the statements that you've often seen it is lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on mine. Similarly, boards have a hard time differentiating between the important and the urgent and figuring out whether or not something is, it might be urgent, but it might not be important. And so how do you make those determinations when people are coming at you with their full emotional thing? And so part of the things change, but what can happen is you can develop a culture as a board of being self differentiated, of figuring out how to know that you're anxious, but deal with the anxiety in a way that doesn't disrupt you. So you're never going to get it all right. You're never going to get it all done, but you can move your culture more and more toward a way of the systems thinking that can help you not be as reactive in that kind of situation. And one book, just to let you know, I can't remember if Sharon mentioned it in her thing, that I recommend all boards read is Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times. Peter Steinke uses a lot of Bowen theory in this book, and I recommend that boards read this and discuss it together. So maybe the subtitle is Being Calm and Courageous No Matter What. But it is all about church systems and systems theory. And so it takes Rabbi Edwin Friedman took the work of the Bowen Center and Murray Bowen and applied it to congregations. And he has a book called Generation to Generation. I think it's Generations to Generations, can't remember. And that really talks about how does this apply within congregational life. And Steinke trained with Friedman, worked with Friedman, and came up with this, which is a little easier to be able to digest than some of Friedman's work. So, Patricia. There you go.
I have a question about what do you share with your congregation? Every month, myself and the vice president write an article for our newsletter that is supposed to give the congregation some clue as to what the board is doing. I almost always want to give details of what the board is doing, where we are in certain things. And generally, it seems like the board is much more wanting to keep things secret until a decision has been made or until a congregational meeting, which only happens once a year. Mm-hmm. And how do you determine how much you share with the full congregation?
And that's a great conversation for your board to have. What do we want to share? At what point do we want to let people know, hey, we're talking about whether or not to plant an apple tree or put up a playground? I'm just picking wildly out of the sky here. But when do you want to get their feedback? When do you want to let them know? Certainly personnel issues you don't share with the congregation. But at what point do you want feedback? I often recommend that boards have meetings 4 times a year at least, where town halls, where they just share, hey, here are the things we're talking about, and get people's feedback and that kind of thing. So, but it really depends on congregation culture to congregation culture. I generally say share being as open as possible. I mean, because if people are allowed to attend your meetings, yes, but do people want the detail? And you could also ask your congregation, what do you want to know? And to have a conversation with the board, have a conversation with the congregation rather than what do you want to know? Okay, I'm just, and other people are saying they post things or they have banters with the board on the members section and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, part of it is every congregation is different. Some will say, hey, here are the big topics we're talking about. And others will say, here are, we'll say, hey, we're looking at our physical plant and what's going on with that. Or we're talking about how are changes in society impacting what our mission and vision is and how do we do that. So there's there's that whole large range of things. All right, I think we have time for like maybe one more comment before I talk about next time we gather. Anybody want to get the last word in other than me? All right, I don't see anyone raising their hand or saying things right now. So just let me tell you, next time, Sharon and I will be co-leading the session. It won't be me as the marionette, the person pulling the marionette, is the thing. I don't know what the person who operates the marionette is called.
Puppeteer.
Puppeteer, all right. I didn't know puppeteer worked for that too, so I'm glad to know. Okay, so this week I was sort of the puppeteer and, having Sharon's voice move on the recording and, all that kind of stuff and trying to field things. But it's, so we will be co-teaching next time and we're going to be talking about conflict. We will be revisiting this case study. So hold on to your copy of it or get ready to do it next time. The preparatory work is already up on our UU Institute site, and the Zoom information is up there. And don't forget that you can always post comments and things in the chat that's in the UU Institute site. There was some great discussion back and forth, and Sharon I loved her answer to someone's question. She said, well, put on your fuzzy slippers if you want to, pay attention to this. And it was a long explanation that was helpful to many of you, I think. So, so that is great. So with that, I just want to wish you well. You're getting out of school an hour and a half early today. I won't tell anyone that. So if you want to hide away for the next hour and a half, you can then make sure that, I won't blow your secret. So I give you back this time and I look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks' time. And so thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa. This was great.